Hello and welcome to the Growing Healthy Families podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Haggerty. On this show, I interview the world's top health experts so that you can know with certainty what it takes to give your family a life of epic health and wellness.
As parents, we don't want to see our kids struggle. I knew that he had the potential, and I knew that something needed to be done.
It was hard. We would get frustrated. We didn't know how to deal with it. I was more emotional about it.
Sure that, we're here. Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. All right. So first, thank you all so much for being here tonight. The goal is to give you a very different perspective than what you may have ever heard about neurodevelopmental disorders. We are going to try and keep it on point to about an hour and a half. So this way we can have, give or take, a half an hour at the end if you have questions. As we go through, we'll try to address as many questions as we can, but if there's something you want some additional clarification on, go ahead and stop us. There's no big rush for us. We're here to try and just make sure that we give you tons of great information that you can take back into school tomorrow and be able to go help a lot more kids. All right, excellent. So let's talk about the big problem. Over the course of the last 25 years, we have watched the kids in the classrooms, kids in our homes get sicker and sicker and sicker. We are seeing an escalation like we've never seen before in children going down the pathway of neurodevelopmental disorders. So we are currently at a pace right now that it's almost staggering. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the recent stats, but I'm going to give you some information here as we move forward that I think might shock many of you. So as we dig in, we're going to start talking about several different things. Let me put these up here so if you're taking notes, you can have all this. First, we're going to talk about the missing pieces. One of the big things that we hear from moms, dads, teachers, other people in healthcare is, why are so many kids developing neurodevelopmental challenges? We intend to clarify that today. How stress is directly affecting and wrecking our kids and our health. We're going to talk about how the brain and the nervous system is built to work. We're going to talk about common threads that exist between multiple different types of neurodevelopmental disorders. And then we're going to provide you with resources to help your students, so both in class and at home. All right?
And as we get started, just how long has everyone been teaching?
26 years.
26.
40.
40.
7.
7.
30.
Okay, so even more so probably for those of you that have been 20 plus years, have you seen a big change in your classrooms with, everyone's shaking yes. And I don't know about the 7, because we've kind of been in this for a while now, so I don't know if you've noticed a lot of change, but I had a feeling that you guys may have. Okay, so it's going to resonate very much.
Yes, very much. So let us first tell you why we're here, because our story is really what drove us to be able to go and help moms and dads and teachers to have a better understanding. So we have 2 little kids. So you met our little son who is in here, our little 6-year-old guy, and we have an 8-year-old little girl. And when we were in chiropractic school is when she got pregnant, and we planned for this perfect, natural, no intervention, labor, delivery, birth process. Like, we wanted to be as crunchy as could be. And as many people have it, not everything quite happened as we had anticipated. So when our little girl was born, it was an extremely difficult labor and delivery. It was very long, 33 hours. So, and our little girl was not little, 10 pounds, 8 ounces. So she was a big girl. So, but what ended up happening is that it was a very difficult labor and delivery process. As she's hitting 28 hours, and we're getting to a point where everything that naturally we've been trained to do wasn't working. We had to make some decisions. Some of those decisions were looking at what are our options. And so we made the decision together to have her have an epidural so that she could relax. Her contractions had been relentless, so at no more or no less than 2 minutes apart, and they were excruciatingly painful. They were not giving her a break, and she was exhausted. She got the epidural. She rested for a few hours, and
Just loving myself.
thank you. and to get things started again, so she had the Pitocin to start getting things moving. As she transitioned and got into the delivery process, it was very, very hard on both her and on my little girl. When my daughter was delivered, so we talked with the OB and the nursing staff, and what we found out is that our poor little girl's head and face was being jammed into my wife's pubic bone with every single contraction.
Right.
So she was positioned obliquely.
We thought she was head down, but she was actually right here. And so that's why she wasn't making any movement. And that's why everything got stuck and everything got delayed, and that's why it took 2.5 hours to push her out.
Mm-hmm.
So it was
And-
not what we anticipated.
No.
She was swollen
Very.
and bruised, and we didn't have any idea what that meant at the time, but we soon figured it out.
Yep.
She was colicky, she was constipated, she didn't feed well, she didn't
Torticollis.
latch well, she didn't go to the bathroom well, she didn't sleep well. So she was a very difficult baby. And then as she got older, she was a difficult toddler. She was very emotional. A female, yes. So you're already like, okay, well, you're a girl. But you're just like, you're my first kid, so I don't necessarily know what this would be like, but it just didn't seem normal to us. And I'm like, something is going on. And we're chiropractors, we're doing what we know to do. She's eating well. We're living a healthy life. We're all the right stuff, and the problems just weren't resolving themselves. And so then we were looking for answers, looking for resources, came across a doctor, a chiropractor in Illinois who was helping a bunch of kids with a variety of things. Seizures, autism, bedwetting, like you name it, he was helping it. And we got into conversations and wanted to know more about what he was doing, and quickly learned that, there was a lot that we've been missing along the way. And so we started digging into the research and the science and everything that we could to try to help her, and that brings us to where we are now.
Yep. And so, we'd been trying to help our little girl, and one of the things that was incredibly frustrating is that we had done the things that we known to do. One of the things that, the doctor's name is Dr. Tony Ebel, and one of the things that he showed us is that all of the things externally that she was showing us, we didn't know how to look at it and find out what was going on inside of her brain and her nervous system. And it was really frustrating because we wanted to help her, but at the same time, we did not have resources. One of the things that was most empowering is that once we understood how to look at, how to evaluate, but also understanding the neurological processes that she and kids in general with neurodevelopmental challenges had gone through, it also made it much more understandable on how to then jump in and help. And so what we'll do over the course of the next hour and a half is we're going to unpack this. And we're going to unpack it a step at a time because there's a lot of things that will start to make sense, and we want this to be building blocks because there's a lot of things here that we'll put together for you that will make sense in terms of what you see in the classroom, what you're seeing maybe with your own children, or maybe with people that you know. And this will help you to give perspective as to how these things evolve over time and why we start seeing the symptoms as an evolution, not just a child develops ADHD one day and that's all that it was. Okay, so let me go through, and I want to give you a little stats. This is interesting. So when you look at the current stats, as of 2016, most recent stats available, so nearly 2/3 of children with a current diagnosis of ADHD have other comorbidities. So we're talking mental, emotional, behavioral. 1 out of 2 children with ADHD has a behavior conduct disorder, and about 1 out of 3 with ADHD also has anxiety. Many kids also have common comorbidities like depression, autism, spectrum disorders, and Tourette's, which I'm sure many of you see with kids in your classrooms. So here's another illustration of that. So see it a little bit more graphically. It's stunning when you start seeing how fast ADHD has really become part of the mainstream vernacular with what we see at home and what we see in school and what we see in clinics like ours. I want to show you something here that hit home. So the percent of all kids 2 to 17 in the U.S. taking ADHD meds is 5.2. Almost a little over 3.8 million kids in the United States on ADHD meds. So, that's obviously a staggering stat, right? And I know that if any of us had the ability to help kids to not go down that direction, right, it would be something that we think would be priority for all of us because, all meds have side effects. And the more that the child's brain can work the way that it's supposed to, it makes your life easier, it makes the child's life easier, it makes home life easier for moms and dad. So let's move forward here. Here's some of the stats by age group. So the percentages of children in the United States with the ADHD that are taking meds. It's a lot, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So our grand mission here is very simple. We want to empower everybody that we meet, moms, dads, teachers, healthcare providers, to have understanding. So we've created workshops like this This is our podcast called Growing Healthy Families. It's on iTunes and Stitcher. It's a free resource. I would encourage you to subscribe to it. I think it will be very helpful. What we do on the podcast is we dig heavy into family health issues with a heavy emphasis on neurodevelopmental challenges. And so we've interviewed some of the top researchers from all over the world in the field of research, top authors like Dr. Robert Malillo, who's written a number of books that we'll dig into here, you name it. And so the goal is this for it to become a resource so that you can have access to things that you can go to look for and know that it's non-biased. So it's all things that we've vetted, we've made sure that, high evidence that could be things that you could take into your home or into the classroom right away and get value out of. Does that sound good? Okay. So here's a quote I want everybody to write down. The function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. Tell me when you're done.
Me too.
As you guys finish writing, what's the word that sticks out to you in that sentence?
Coordinate and perceive behavior.
Mm-hmm. Because what drives what?
Aren't they all interactive, right?
Mm-hmm. Perception drives behavior. Because the nervous system is an input to output relationship. So, does everyone have this down? All right, excellent. So let's put context, okay? So, ladies, whoever had a headache? Right now. Okay.
Oh.
Perfect. Okay, so for those of you who don't have one right now, let's just kind of dig and remember what it's like when we do. Okay, so first, not just physically, but mentally, how do you feel?
Foggy.
No more think.
Mm-hmm. Right?
And be left alone.
Mm-hmm. So what is it like to try to organize your thoughts right now when you have a headache?
It's
More
the headache's
difficult.
the headache's always on the forefront, and then everything else you're like, okay, now back to focus, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, try to put that aside, like, oh, maybe I should get more snacks. No.
Mm-hmm. So how are you emotionally when you have a headache?
Not my happiest.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes a little more crabby, a little more irritable, a little more short-tempered, not as patient, right? So has anyone ever had a headache so bad that it caused nausea? Mm-hmm. What about issues with your balance?
And then vision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've had vision too.
Okay. So if you were to take away the pain from the equation, what you are left with is ADHD. Because the function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. Did you know that greater than 90% of all headaches come from your neck?
I didn't know it was that percentage. But
Yes, greater than 90%. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start putting this together so you have context as to why that is. Because as you start thinking about what that is like when you have a headache and understand how the two are interrelated, it'll also give you context as to what the kids are going through when you see times when they're a little more wired, a little more out of focus, because what it is, it's a perception issue, right? We always think of the behaviors, but in the grand perspective, perception is what drives how we behave. So let's move on here a little bit. So let's talk about this concept. When we talk about the gas pedal versus the brake pedal, we're going to use some car analogies today because I think it makes it a little bit easier as we go through this to put this all together. So has anyone ever heard of the autonomic nervous system before? Okay, so let's go top down. Brain's master controller, right? Runs the show, okay? But it doesn't do it without having an air traffic controller. Air traffic controller is the autonomic nervous system, okay? So part one, parasympathetic, rest, digest, growth, development, healing, learning, memory, speech, executive function. Essential that all of us are able to live there. And if we're not, it's because our brain has switched gears into sympathetic, which is fight or flight stress response. Okay? The way the nervous system is built is that you cannot be in growth and protection mode at the same time. Okay? So when we have stressors, it can tilt the balance so that the nervous system is over-perceiving or overusing the stress response, right? That's why when we have a headache, so we're a little more crabby, a little more difficult with regulating our emotions, a little more irritable, sensory system is a little bit more active, because our nervous system is using the stress side when it should be in rest and digest side. So when we talk about things that can trigger stress responses, there are three primary drivers of our stress response: thoughts, traumas, toxins, and now we have a fourth, which is technology. Okay? And so let's dive into those a little bit deeper. When we talk,
Do you all use technology in your classroom? Is that what
Yes.
they're all geared that way?
Mhm.
The state tests are on technology too,
Mhm.
so they have to know how to use them too.
So they literally can't get away from it, even if they wanted to.
Right. So where we start getting into the way the brain works when it comes to stress, there's an important term I want to talk about. It's nerves that wire together, fire together. Has anyone ever heard that term before? It's learning. It's neurological learning, okay? Anything that we do, we make associations, right? So once we learn to read, right, it start putting those connections, and we wire and fire through repetition and practice. Anything the brain does, it becomes what we call neuroplastic. It rewires and refires to make the pathway stronger and more efficient. When we're learning skills, when we're doing things that are productive, it can be awesome. When we are living with a background of the stress division working too hard, that can also be bad. Because the nervous system, because of the way that it's wired, since you cannot be in growth and protection at the same time, if our nervous system gets tripped over into stress mode and we can't get out of stress mode, then what that does, it affects the way that we function on a daily basis, because now the stress division is working when the cognitive development, rest development, growth and rest, digest, growth, development, and healing side of the nervous system should be the primary driver. Is this making sense so far? So as we talk about the effect of all of the thoughts, the traumas, the toxins, and technology, it's as we are exposed to things that create stress responses in us. Anytime that we go over the tipping point and we become stressed, our nervous system will go in, tap into our stress reserves, and the more it's there and the less time it's spent in recovery mode, the easier it is for us to turn that stress response on, right? And I'm sure probably many of you can relate to this. Who has a kid, when they walk in your classroom, you instantly get anxious or on edge? Right? Who, when you think about that child at home, without them being there, you instantly get anxious? Right? It happens. So what that did is it wired and fired into your nervous system that child causes you a stress response. So when you encounter them, instantly your brain switches gears. Okay? And the more that you're around them, the more irritable you become around them, right? Because now you're sensitizing, or you're becoming more and more easily accessing that division of the stress response that child evokes. Does that make sense when I say this now? All right, excellent. So when we talk about the parasympathetics are critical to the equation, because if we get out of balance and we're not spending enough time rest, digest, growth, development, healing, then our brain will become tipped towards the stress side, and stress is becoming perpetual in the nervous system. Balance is the key to how we live life. So I want to show you something about the way the stress response works, okay? So this here is a model of how the brain is wired, okay? So up here is what's called the prefrontal cortex, okay? Everyone knows what the prefrontal cortex is? All executive function, this is where all higher learning happens, okay? So right down here is an area of the brain that's called the cerebellum. Has anyone ever heard of the cerebellum before? Okay. So do you know what the cerebellum's job is?
Filters and organizes all.
Good, you're right. You're right. So it also determines which division is going to be used, because our brain is always filtering and perceiving the sensory input. And if the sensory input comes in and is calming, then our brain sends it up to the prefrontal cortex. If there's something that's tripping the stress response, our brain sends a sensory input here to that little dude called the amygdala, which is your stress and anxiety center. If you know of anybody that has anxiety or is angry or is aggressive, they're using that little part of their brain way too much, not spending enough time up there, because their brain has learned to be very efficient at tripping the stress response. Does that make sense? So when we talk about balance, the nervous system is really built to be like a teeter-totter, right? We should have a stressor, and as soon as the stressor is over, we recalibrate, recenter, rebalance, get back over into growth and development mode, okay? What you're seeing with kids who have neurodevelopmental challenges, all to varying degrees based upon the severity of their challenge, their brain is using that amygdala more and more and more, and less of the prefrontal cortex. The brain's changing the way that it wires internally, okay? And there's a number of different effects that come from this. Now, moms and dads, I'm gonna guess probably if you have come to this workshop and you've heard the word pediatric chiropractors, you're probably wondering, why are chiropractors talking about ADHD? Have you thought that yet? Okay, here's something really important. So our practice, we are specialty. We work specifically with neurodevelopmental challenges. And there's some really interesting research that's come out over the course of the last several years that talks about how the brain is dramatically affected by adjusting. So a researcher out of New Zealand, she did a number of different studies, and what she found is that when the spine of an adult or a child is adjusted, right, where we restore motion, get rid of the misalignments, it fires this nerve here called the vagus straight up into the prefrontal cortex. And what it does is it simultaneously turns down the function of the amygdala, the stress and anxiety center of the brain. Well, remember we talked about nerves that wire together, fire together? So if you can help the brain to calm down by firing the cortex, what it does over time is it rewires the child's brain to the adult's brain, so that the cortex begins to work more and the sympathetics and the amygdala begin to work less. And it starts to rebalance the equation, okay? In our practice, we see literal miracles. And I'll share with you some stories over the course of the night so you can understand a little bit more about what we see.
And so you might be wondering how the kids are stuck in sympathetic state, right? I don't know if that question's come into your mind yet, like, especially for those of you that have been teaching for a couple decades now, you know, what's changed? Why are, even when I went to school, right, like allergies alone, we were allowed to eat peanut butter. My kids' school now, no peanuts, no nuts of any kind, right? They're banned. Can't have them on the premises. What's changed? Why are kids so sensitized? Why are they so stuck over in sympathetic and can't kick over to parasympathetic? So I know that he briefly mentioned about trauma, thoughts, and toxins, and then technology. So technology, that's an easy one, right? We didn't have technology. Like, we had one great big TV in the house, and that was pretty much it. There was no computer.
With the remote control.
Yeah, right. You physically got up and turned the giant knob that fell off. Like, that's what it was. And so we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have computers. We didn't have any of that. And in school, you had books and paper and pens, and that was that. They didn't even have PowerPoints back then. They had the overhead projectors, and right. So now I'm gonna date myself a little bit, but it's totally different now. So that one's easy. That's a stimulant, right? It's constantly keeping their brain
Aroused.
fired, wired, aroused. Then you think about, there's the thoughts, right? That's stress. So how many homes have more stress now than they've ever had? And that's just a product of how I think life has evolved. Most parents now both work in the home. Kids have a lot more going on. I mean, I know we try to limit it, but we still experience it. Kids are in sports, and they're in this, and they're in that, and you're just trying to make sure that they're keeping up with everything they're supposed to know. Our kids both read in kindergarten. Like, I didn't read in kindergarten. You know, it was different. So there's financial stress, and there's home stress, and there's health stress, and there's, you name it, right? I think they're feeling more of that because life is so fast paced. And then there's the toxins. And you can have that conversation all day long. The food supply has changed. Like, I think we all know that. I mean, how into it you are varies, but now there's non-GMO and organic, but things have changed, right? There's more foods that are preserved. There's more chemicals in our food. There's more pollution in the environment, the water supply. And some could argue that that's better than it's ever been because we know more. Like, now we know about GMO, and we know about organic, and we know about this, and we know about that. But for those that aren't as is aware of bringing it into their home, if you're going the other route, it's probably worse than it's ever been, right? And so you're getting some of that chemical stress. And then meds. When he talked about what percentage of kids are on meds, that was just for ADHD. That didn't talk about how sick they are with antibiotics and all the other things, the anxiety and the depression and you name it, they're on it. From babies, they're on Prilosec, right? For reflux, so they say. And so you're just seeing more chemical stressors, whether necessary or not, more chemical stressors in their body. And then there's the trauma. And we do a whole nother workshop that talks a lot about this, but birth trauma is at an all-time high. So birth, and I don't know how many of you are moms, but birth is traumatic in the best of circumstances. I always say that, right? Even a healthy vaginal delivery without any intervention is still squeezing something like this out of something like this, right? Like there's gonna be some repercussions to that, natural ones. But then you're talking about all the other. The C-section rate is at an all-time high.
And we'll dig into that.
Interventions are at an all-time high. And so babies are going into the NICU, they're being given meds, they're having all this stuff done and going through this process which wires that stress into them from the very beginning. And so they're coming out stressed, they're coming out into it, and then it's just perpetuating itself with the home stress, the financial stress, the food stress, the chemical, right, the technology stress. And so what you're seeing is this huge uprise in kids being born into and stuck in a sympathetic state, and they can't flip over. Does that make sense a little bit? Just give a little background on why you're seeing what you are.
Mm-hmm. So as Dr. Leiden mentioned too, when we get all these stressors and it starts to wire our nervous system so we can't flip gears. So there's a nerve, and many of you may have heard this, but I want to talk about this real quick because it's important that we understand this. Whenever you talk about the way that the brain's wired, there's a nerve called the vagus nerve that lives on the brainstem. I'm going to show you where this is. So here's the brain, here's the brainstem. This nerve here is the vagus nerve. This vagus nerve is the single most important nerve in the entire body. So when you send a kid over to the OTs, right, they're always doing proprioceptive exercises, or they're doing things to try and stimulate movement. What they're trying to do is turn this nerve on. Because that nerve is the nerve that comes up here and turns on the prefrontal cortex. It suppresses the stress response. This nerve is the one when we get to, let's say for example, somebody cuts us off on the highway, and we're, right, and we start doing some deep breaths. Or a kid gets upset in class, and you're like, take a few deep breaths, and they calm down. The reason why that works is because you're stimulating the vagus nerve. And if you look at some of the things that the nerve goes into, right, it is what slows down the heart, it's what lowers blood pressure, it's what controls the lungs so that they can open and close, dilate and expand naturally. It's what controls the stomach, the blood vessels in the abdomen, the liver, the pancreas, your kidneys and your adrenal glands, the small intestines, and a significant portion of your large intestine. It's the monitor. Remember we talked about the way that stress works, right? Well, when stress turns on, we see consequences that are internal as well. That's what we talked about, like when someone gets a headache and all of a sudden they become nauseous. It's because that nerve right there is not working the way that it should, right? Because if you get nauseous and you've got a headache, is that a stomach problem or a nerve problem? It's a nerve problem. It's dysfunction in the way that nerve is working. And so when we look at the way this nerve is built to work, 85% of its job is input. Talking to the brain about the internal environment. 15% is what do I do to heal and regulate myself? So understanding this is really critical to also understanding how to help kids when you see stress escalating in the classroom. How to help them to calm down. Because what we'll dig into as we move is that you want to keep that guy as active as you can, but also understand their nervous system is like teapots, right? Don't want to put them too close to boiling, right? You want to keep the temperature low so that they're able to stay on focus, so that they're able to regulate their emotions and their behaviors with just enough stim breaks so that they continue to move forward, not be disruptive in class. Does that make sense? Awesome. All right, so let's spend a second here talking about this, because we're going to dig into this quite a bit in terms of the spine and the way that the spine works. because this will give you some insights as to why so many kids are going down the road of neurodevelopmental challenges and how early it actually starts. So this here, when we talked about the headaches, the reason why we talked about that is because this area here is the most important area of the spine, right? It's where the brainstem enters into the from the spinal column through the spinal cord into the brain, okay? That area is absolutely loaded with nerves. And when we talk about nerves, right, we're not talking about like the nerves that control our ears, right? We're talking about nerves that influence the way that our brain gets information in from our body. And so has anyone ever heard the term proprioception before? Okay, all right. So what I want you to do is I want you to keep your eyes up here and wiggle your toes. Who's doing it? How do you know you're doing it? You're not looking at your toes.
I can feel it.
You can feel them, right?
Yeah.
So your proprioceptive sense is the most important sense. At rest, sitting here right now, 90% of your brain's energy is being devoted to that one sense. Okay. In your body, every joint and every muscle has these little proprioceptors. It's the reason that we can walk up and down the stairs. It's the reason that we can touch our fingers to our noses, why we can play sports, why we can walk, why we can drive. Everything that we do to move our body against gravity requires proprioceptive input, okay? If we lose proprioception, then guess what happens? It triggers a stress response in our body. All of the vertebrae are loaded with these little proprioceptors. So in our body, with 100% being our total body, 100% of the proprioceptors, 60% of those live on the spinal column. 33% of that 60% live right there. So when you have a child that goes through a rough delivery, what area do you think is the area that's most affected by it? Right there, okay? So it's like blowing the main breaker to the entire nervous system when that area is affected as a part of birth process. And we'll talk about this because we want to understand that it's a conversation, right? The brain is wired so that it's a constant conversation.
And the vagus nerve runs right down that way too. So the vagus nerve they talked about, the biggest parasympathetic nerve that we have in our body, it runs from here, down the side of the neck. Okay, so when that area is impacted in a birth trauma, you're not only affecting the proprioceptive input, you're also affecting the function of the vagus nerve, which is your biggest contributor to parasympathetic state.
Is this making sense so far? So we have to understand that the role that the spine plays in growth and development is when it moves, then what it does is it calms and organizes all sensory input. When it stops moving, what it does is, depending upon where and how far away from the brainstem it is, it's like a volume control, right? And for those of you who've ever hurt your back, right, like you'd say the volume's pretty loud. But when you talk about what it does to the brain, so the closer you get to the brainstem, the louder the influence is on development. Because it's built to be a conversation, right? All of this, the sensory input coming in from the body is built to ascend the spinal cord, go up to the brainstem, and then ascend to go up to the prefrontal cortex for the brain to decide how to go and operate and manage your body and then correct output, right? If areas of the spine stop moving, and there's a term that we use this term, it's called subluxation. And it's a combination of three things. It's a combination of the misalignment, right? And when you guys have a stiff neck, you know exactly what I'm talking about, which you typically get with a headache. But it's not just the misalignment, it's the loss of motion. Because lost motion equals lost proprioception. When you have lost proprioception, it tips the balance so that instead of getting the calming influence of proprioception, it triggers on this term that we call nociception, which is the stress response. And so the longer that it's there, especially when it starts there early and often, what it does is it becomes a perpetual background noise. Kind of like, who here dislikes Metallica or heavy metal or gangster rap or whatever it is, right? So think about how it is if you were to play that perpetually all the time, right? What would that do to the way that you would feel, pay attention? Imagine developmentally if, like with a headache, if from the moment a child's born, they've got this background noise there from the second they enter this world, right? And then you have the add-ons of the NICU stays, or you have all of the stressors of, maybe mom and dad are fighting, and you perceive that stress. Or maybe you're like a typical child, right, who falls 10,000 times between the time they start to walk and the time they're 5 years old, right? And don't they always seem to like lead with their butts or their heads, like every time, right? And so the spinal column has to absorb those forces, and the more of those areas that stop moving, the bigger the volume becomes, right? You guys have known that. Like you fall or you hurt yourself, you tweak your neck, you tweak your back, and all of a sudden, not only can you not move for days, but man, you just don't feel like yourself. And maybe sometimes you can't go to the bathroom, right? Because now things are just not moving no matter how hard you try. And your body doesn't work the way that it's supposed to because the nerves aren't communicating to the brain and the brain's input can't create proper output. Does that make sense?
And so if you think about it, proprioception is positive input.
Mm-hmm.
And nociception is noxious input or no good input. You're going to get one or the other. So in the absence of positive input, the brain automatically picks up the bad input. And so what you're seeing with a lot of these kiddos who can't, just take ADHD, they can't sit still, right? I mean, all of you in the classroom, like they always want to move, right? And you might see other kids, like they're rocking in their chair, or they're fidgeting with pencils.
Or they get excited and
or they want to chew gum, or they just want, right? Like
jump
they
all the
want to
time.
move. They're trying to create proprioception. They don't know that, but that's what their brain is trying to do. They're trying to create that positive input for themselves to calm their brain because they're not getting it naturally the way that they should because their body, their spine's not giving it to them, right? So they're trying to bring it in. And when they can't bring it in, they've got all that background noise, that Metallica going on, which is why they have trouble focusing and paying attention and listening to what you're saying and sitting still.
maintaining eye contact,
Right? I'm sure you see it all the time.
controlling their emotions.
They can't do it. And so instead they're trying to do it, and I believe a lot of them really want to do it, but their brain is not letting them.
Mm-hmm. And so let's make this real, okay? So let me tell you a story about a little girl named Julia. So Julia right now, she's in second grade. So we've known Julia now for a little over a year. Huh? I'm sorry, third
Yeah,
grade.
she just,
Third grade.
I know we've had it for a while.
No. So when we first met Julia, and her mom, if you want to hear the whole story, her mom actually I interviewed her on the podcast. Bob made me cry because, when people tell you about what's going on, they only tell you this much of the story. But the highlights of what she had told us when we first met her was that super high intervention birth, like really traumatic labor and delivery, and they had signs from the very beginning. So she was the typical colicky baby. She was a constipated baby. She was a baby that had to be walked constantly to get her to go to sleep. She had an explosive, mom's words, she had an explosive temper. From the time that she was a toddler, she had an explosive temper, and as she got older, it translated into she was having real difficulty at school. She was having massive anxiety. Teachers were sending notes home all the time. The typical morning routine would take 45 minutes to get her out of bed because when she would tell her to get up and go and get dressed, she would kick and scream and yell on her bed for 45 minutes, right? So obviously, I'm sure all of us can imagine like the quality of life impact just in the home side. But then in school, she wouldn't sit still. She was constantly disruptive. She had a very, very short temper, always needing to be redirected. And so when I first talked with mom, her big goals were calm the temperament down, right? Like because the explosive temper was affecting everybody's life, home, school, and everywhere they went, to the point where like they were socially withdrawing because they just didn't know what to do else to help her. So as we started working with her, part of how we go about our process is we went through and we did the analysis like I talked about with my little girl. And we started digging into what she had. We knew that there was this evolution of how the stress had built up, and one symptom was evolving into another, even though she'd been told, well, she'll grow out of it as she gets older. But it wasn't. It was evolving into new symptoms, and it was new behaviors. And the behaviors that were there were getting worse. And so the anxiety was now becoming aggression, and the temper tantrums were getting progressively worse. And so we started talking about how we're going to go and move forward. And so as we started in care with her, what we always talked about with her mom is very simple goal: restore balance. If the nervous system is locked on the sympathetics and we have to get the sympathetics to calm down, then we have to start doing things both here and at home that help her nervous system to calm down, okay? And so as we went through the care process, what we started watching was she began to just, first phase was calm. There started to be breaks in her temper tantrums. her energy level started to come down because as the input through her brain was starting to change, the influence of the parasympathetics was starting to become more evident because now she was becoming a little more logical. She was able to sit still for longer periods of time to complete homework at home, and she was able to sit still for longer periods of time at school. Her behaviors were becoming more consistent, and her temperament was getting longer and longer on the fuse. And as we progressed, we watched her little brain rewire. And her mom started reporting that she was seeing a little different girl emerge because all of a sudden, instead of having this rapid stress, rapid fight or flight response, all of a sudden she was able to handle things in a way that she said, quote unquote, was more normal, right? But her brain rewired and refired. And so when we start looking at how the cortex works, that's what we want to see. The balance shifted, and as balance was restored, behaviors changed, right? That's the goal for everybody, is we want the child to be able to have normal responses in a situation of stress, not get stuck, but on day-to-day life, not have overreactions, not perceive things from the position of having an emotional reaction when you shouldn't have an emotional reaction, right? Does that make sense?
But I think you're probably still wondering what chiropractic has to do, right? He told you the story, but you probably still don't understand how it ties together. So when he talked about the spine, right, and the lack of motion, meaning the lack of proprioception, so it creates interference. We call it subluxation. It's the fancy S word. But basically it's the misalignment, or it's equal to stress. It's interference between the brain and the body, right? So we said all those proprioceptors live in the spine. When there's lack of movement, lack of motion, you're not getting the proprioceptive input for the body to talk to the brain. So what we do is we adjust, we put motion, very calculated, very specific, based on nerve scans, like we know exactly what we're doing and who we're doing it for, but we put very specific motion into very specific areas of the spine to then allow it to communicate and send that up to the brain to stimulate that parasympathetic response that he talked about at the beginning in the picture. Okay, do you want to elaborate on it?
I think you did a great job.
Okay. Does that make sense? Because I know sometimes people have a hard time understanding how one relates to the other, right? But it's all interconnected. And so then when you see kids like Julia over time, or adults too, I mean, we see all of it, that repeated input of positive motion, of positive input, positive feedback, feeds the brain into a calmer state.
And it rewires and refires. So let's start talking about why so many kids now are being diagnosed with neurodevelopmental challenges. When you look here, 87% of all live births have some form of intervention, and this is per DHS, Department of Health Statistics.gov. So, and that includes epidurals, Pitocin, cesareans, episiotomies, vacuum, and forceps. To give you comparisons, so I was born in 1975. When I was born in 1975, the national average per DHS.gov is 25% of all live births had an intervention. There is nothing that has evolved or changed more in the last generation than has that number. It has been consistently increasing year over year over year over year at a pace faster than anything else. Because we know that the interventions trigger the stress response, and it becomes something that is ongoing. And it causes the child's nervous system to have a massive disruption to early development, and it lasts sometimes for a lifetime. So when we talk about this concept, then we talk about proprioception. We talked about this a little bit before, is the proprioceptive sense and its job. 90% of the brain's energy is devoted to proprioception. So proprioception calms the brain and organizes all sensory input. This is why the proprioceptive sense is something the brain requires constant input from. So we talked about lost proprioception triggers the stress response. It decreases the activity of the prefrontal cortex. And we talked about how it becomes like a broken filter. So has anyone ever gone over to like mom's house or a friend's house and they're baking? And they're like got this like the beautiful smell of like cake or brownies or something like that when you walk in? Okay. And you smell it, and it's real strong when you first come in. But after about 5 minutes or so, do you notice you don't smell it anymore? Right? Like you'd have to go up to it and like really take a whiff, even though the aroma's still in the air. So what you have to understand is what your brain did is this thing called attenuation. Have you heard that term before? So your brain works with a series of filters. So it's called attenuation. It's the reason why you can sit here and there's distractions and things going on, little noises and the tags on your shirt and the feeling of your shoes. And unless we make you aware of it, you don't notice that they're there because your brain is prioritizing what you need to pay attention to, okay? If your brain can't filter it, then the sensory input coming up the spinal cord to the spinal column isn't working the way that it should because nociception disrupts sensory input. And now instead of being able to attenuate, you perceive everything because now it's all coming in and the brain can't select what to choose to pay attention to. Right? That's why when a kid with ADHD, you're trying to talk to them and they're looking all around and they won't make eye contact, or, you know, they hear every sound, like, you know, the kid who's doing this and it drives them nuts, and, you know, every little thing will stress them out because they're living with this background noise constantly, can't filter, but also, in addition to can't filter it, it also is triggering stress responses, right? Whereas conversely, a kid with ADHD, right, the brain has got so much coming in.
He's the one doing that, right?
So with the kid with ADD, right, attention deficit without the hyperactivity, they're the kid who's got everything coming in, but now their brain is having a difficult time not just perceiving it, but putting it together, right? And you guys probably see this all the time, right? Typical low-tone kid, so who's got the potential, kind of like the ADHD kid. They're super bright, right? And if they could just slow down, they'd get a million more things done if they could just focus for 5 more minutes. Whereas the ADHD kid, it takes a lot for them to be able to put it together because their nervous system took a different path. The stressors that they experienced early, not only did it cause too much information to come in they can't filter, but also it decreased the ability of the brain to organize it. The ADD kid, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means when you get a little further along. But the response that the brain has is that background noise, based upon that child's journey, affects the way that they're going to go down the pathway of different types of neurodevelopmentals. So let's talk a little bit more about the way that birth process is involved in this, because I want to spend some time on this with you. So when we talk about the birth process, right, a standard, uncomplicated vaginal delivery has 20 to 40 pounds of what they call axial traction with lateral bending. Now let me give you perspective, right, because even in the best of deliveries, right, super gentle, super easy peasy, the OB, the midwife, still has to help the baby out, right? And so even if they do their best, there still sometimes can be just a little bit too much force, a little bit too much torque, a little too much twisting on the neck, okay? And when you think about the amount, and these are all per the American Academy of Obstetricians and Pediatricians, these are their numbers. In a standard vaginal delivery, 20 pounds to 40 pounds of axial traction with lateral bending. So that would be the equivalent of taking your newborn, taking them by the base of the skull, and putting a 20 to 40 pound weight on their legs and going. So do you see the potential for there being some injury to their little spines when that happens, right? Now, let's say you step it up and you get into a vacuum extraction, right? Just a vaginal vacuum extraction. The amount of force is between 40 and 60 pounds of axial traction, lateral, side-to-side bending. C-section, right? And I hear this, and I want to address this because I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, a C-section should be so much easier. C-section is actually far more risk. So there's actually a study we just posted that talked about the strong links that are starting to be present in the research studies between cesarean section and the role of kids going down the pathway of ASD. When a child has a cesarean section, there is no vaginal assist, there's no muscular contraction. It is literally the force of the doctor pulling the baby out from the uterus, manual distraction, lateral bending, and no assist of any musculature at all. It's far harder on them. If you get into, and we see this stuff a lot unfortunately, is a lot of babies have vacuum or forceps as a part of a C-section. The amount of force can peak above 100 pounds. Can you imagine? Now, I'm going to level with you. In the kids that we see that come in that have the worst of the worst of the worst, they are always C-section, vacuum extractor, and combination. In every kid that I have ever taken care of that has autism, Asperger's, seizures, they all had the combos. It's amazing. We've never had a kid that came in that was on the spectrum less one, and it was because of an very early in life fall down a set of stairs that cause significant trauma to a distal dude's neck. Every other kid has been one of those. So these early life stressors, they're a massive impact to the development of a child's nervous system. Thank you for listening to the Growing Healthy Families podcast, the world's #1 source for health education. Make sure to go to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a review. Make sure to follow us on social media at the links listed in the show notes, and let us know what area of health you are struggling with so we can get you and your family on the road to epic health.